Okay, everyone, it's 8:30 my time, so out of respect for everyone's schedules, we're going to go ahead and jump in. Once again, my name is David Patzer, and on behalf of the California Sanitation Risk Management Authority, CSRMA for short, I'd like to welcome you to this morning's webinar on pump station failures and class action lawsuits. With that, let's go ahead and jump in. First off, just a little bit about CSRMA, if you're not familiar with who CSRMA is. CSRMA is a self-insurance pool made up of sanitation districts throughout California. They've been around since 1985, and they're not an insurance company, although they kind of look and act like one in terms of insuring their members. It's more like an insurance cooperative. CSRMA is made up of 60 some odd sanitation districts throughout California. They self-insure each other in a cooperative fashion to provide each other with things like workers' comp insurance, liability insurance, property insurance, that sort of thing. Now, why this is important is if you go back in their history to when they were first formed in 1985, it doesn't matter what year you look at in terms of liability claims. Their most frequent liability claim each and every single year are sewer overflows and sewer backups. And as a result of that, CSRMA has had a lot of experience dealing with these sorts of unfortunate events. And it's because of that experience that the State Water Board Office of Enforcement back in 2011 approached CSRMA and asked for assistance in gearing their inspectors up to perform Sanitary Sewer Management Plan or SSSMP audits. CSRMA, as part of the services they provide their members, we routinely will audit our members not only for regulatory compliance but also for best management practices. Because of our experience dealing with sewer overflows and sewer backups since '85, we've learned a lot of hard lessons. And CSRMA is an organization that has a memory, and we remember those hard lessons, and we try to share those with our members and then develop some best management practices and hold our members accountable to those in order to reduce risk not only for individual members but the pool in general. Now, that's something really important to keep in mind here. CSRMA is a risk management organization, and this typically means pushing our members to go beyond basic regulatory compliance. Because as we can all agree, regulatory compliance is not the gold standard, it is the minimum standard. And any organization's goal should really be focused on managing their risk. If we're managing our risk, regulatory compliance typically falls behind that. So as we go through the material today, I'm going to be talking about a lot of things that go beyond basic regulatory compliance and more towards the direction of risk management. And we're going to be sharing with you a lot of the hard lessons CSRMA has learned over the years through the insurance claims that we've had to deal with. And hopefully your organization can learn from our past mistakes and avoid repeating them for yourself going forward. So I've used the term risk management, and let's give it a definition. There's a lot of definitions floating around on the net, but this is the one I like the best. Risk management is the process of looking into the future from 5 seconds to 5 decades and asking yourself what can possibly go wrong, and then doing whatever you can now to either prevent it from going wrong or at least mitigating its effects should it go wrong. Now, you can remember risk management is not a single thing you do. It's an ongoing process, and you can remember that process with the acronym RPM. R, recognize. You need to understand what your risks are, and if you operate a sanitary sewer system, you're well aware of what your risks are. But now, once we've recognized and identified our risk, we need to prioritize which risks we need to deal with. And in keeping with today's topic, if you operate sewer lift stations or pump stations, this is a risk in our sewer collection system. They're mechanical systems fail. And as the State Water Board CWIC's data has shown, while pump stations don't fail that often, this is where we see the vast majority of sewage spilled throughout California, going back to the formation of CWICs and their collection of data. So while in terms of frequency, pump stations don't fail that often, in terms of severity, how bad the spills are, this is where we see the big, massive spills. So prioritize, and then finally, once we've recognized our risks, we prioritize which ones we can do anything about. We need to act on those risks and take some steps to either prevent them from failing in the first place or just mitigate the effects should they fail. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to use a few terms today, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page with how I use those terms. If you have a sewer overflow out of a manhole or similar structure in your collection system, as we all know, there is a federal prohibition against the discharge of any volume of untreated or partially treated sewage. So if we have an SSO, regardless of volume, we have to report it to the state, and we run the risk of some regulatory liability. Now, similarly, if we have a problem in our collection system and it results in a backup into a home or business or other types of private property, again, this is a violation of the Clean Water Act. This is an SSO, and we need to report it to the state. So once again, we have some regulatory liability. Now, what makes sewer backups different, though, is if you damage private property as a result of a sewer backup, you're going to be facing some civil liability. You're going to be looking down the wrong end of an insurance claim. So for sewer backups, we face both regulatory and civil liability, and for the run-of-the-mill SSOs that don't impact private property, we still have to be aware of the regulatory liability that carries. Now, sewer overflows and backups, they differ in where they come out, but they do share a few things in common, primarily the potential to cost a lot of money. And by the way, the photo on the right, that is a pump station, and the water you see pooled on the ground, that is not rainwater. Now, when you ask yourself who might be interested in an incident like that, the usual players come to mind. The regional board, perhaps the state water board, Fish and Wildlife, county environmental health. But there are some other groups that we need to be aware of as well that are keenly interested in our sewer overflows and our sewer backups. And in particular, if you look in the background of that photo, you're going to see some businesses on that body of water. Now, it's safe to assume those businesses cater to tourists. And if we have a sewage spill impacting that surface water body, we're going to be posting signs. And these signs could theoretically drive the tourists away. And those businesses catering to tourists are not going to be very happy with us. And it's not uncommon for businesses to file a claim against your organization under a theory called business interruption expenses. In other words, you cost them business, and they're going to file a claim against you to try to recover the lost revenue. Now, in addition to private interested parties, we also have to be aware that our sewer overflows and backups, these are very good news stories. And here is just a local TV station here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Recent sewage spill stories. If we have a big sewage spill, in particular if it affects surface waters, you're all but guaranteed the local press is going to get involved, and we have to be aware of that fact and have a plan in place. One, how we're going to communicate with the media, and two, how we want our organization to be portrayed in the media. More on that as we go forward. Now, in addition to the media, we also have another group of folks we need to be aware of that are interested in our sewer overflows and backups. And these are environmental groups throughout California. In this particular case, you see that the city of Modesto paid $161,000 to end a Clean Water Act suit filed against it by the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. Now that raises the question, how do private environmental groups, where do they get the ability to sue you for your sewer spills? And we need to look to the Federal Clean Water Act. In the Federal Clean Water Act, as I mentioned before, there is a prohibition against the discharge of untreated and partially treated sewage of any volume. Now, in the Clean Water Act, there is a provision known as the citizen suit provision, and in a nutshell, the way it works is this. If the regulatory agencies responsible for enforcing the Clean Water Act, and in California it's the State Water Board and the regional boards around the state, if they fail to enforce the Clean Water Act, it opens the door for a private citizen or their representative, and in the case that you see on your screen, a group called Baykeeper, it opens the door for them to file private civil action against your organization. Now, as we're all aware, enforcement action is not taken against us for every one of our sewage spills. And so the argument can be made that the regional board and the state water board isn't doing their job enforcing the Federal Clean Water Act. And that's what opens the door for these citizen suit provisions to be filed against public agencies. Now, in Northern California, we have a couple of groups that are very active. Baykeeper gets a lot of press, but there is an organization that is based out of Northern California that over the past several years has proven themselves to be very litigious. Riverwatch. This organization, as I mentioned, is based out of Northern California, but they currently have active litigation going on against cities and special districts in Southern California as far south as San Diego as well. Now, again, when in the Central Valley, there's another group we need to be aware of, and this is the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. In this case, this is a news story about the city of Stockton settling a $4 million Clean Water Act suit with the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. And something to keep in mind about Clean Water Act suits. Being public agencies, it's highly likely that your organization is a member of a risk-sharing pool. Now, pools around California over the past 6 or 7 years, most of them have been very active tightening up the language in their memorandum of coverage regarding Clean Water Act suits, to the point where they do not cover them. Now, depending on the circumstances, they may help you out with legal defense costs, but the takeaway on this, as you see in the last sentence in the news article, is that any settlements resulting from a Clean Water Act suit is largely going to come out of your own budget. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some regulatory liability. This particular case, we learned a lot about the position of the State Water Board Office of Enforcement. In this particular case, we have a sanitation district on the Central Coast, and one year they had a really bad storm, and the storm resulted in the flooding of an influent pump station at their wastewater treatment plant. It shorted out all the electrical, and as a result, the pump station failed. And they surcharged their collection system. They had 20 observed SSOs, and they flooded 11 homes. This was what you might consider a very bad day for them. Now, this got the attention of the regional board as well as the state water board. And the district, as their defense, they raised the act of God defense, that this storm was so big, so bad, there was nothing the district could have done to prepare for it. And this gives us great insight into the thinking of the Office of Enforcement on the act of God defense. In this quote, we see that the senior staff counsel for the State Water Board's Office of Enforcement argued that the district had years to properly budget funds for projects to address known about problems. As a direct quote, delayed maintenance issues are not acts of God. There were several unresolved issues that were known about and should have been repaired prior to the spill. So the act of God defense in this particular case did not work, and enforcement proceeded. Now, something to keep in mind here is that when enforcement action is going to be taken against us for a sewer spill, there are a few things that the State Water Board Office of Enforcement staff are required to follow in assessing the penalties. First, we need to be aware of something in the Office of Enforcement's official enforcement policy called economic advantage. And in the economic advantage element of their enforcement policy, it is a requirement of the State Water Board enforcement staff to assess penalties in a way that are calculated to eliminate the economic advantage achieved through noncompliance with water quality laws. Now, what you're looking at now is a slide from one of the folks at the Office of Enforcement talking about economic advantage or economic benefit. And in this particular case, any savings or monetary gain derived from acts or failure to act that resulted in the violation. Now, in the enforcement policy from the Office of Enforcement, examples of economic advantage include not having the correct equipment or quantity of equipment, not providing staff training, not having the required policies and procedures, leaving staff positions unfilled, delayed or deferred maintenance. These are all examples of decisions that have an economic value. And if it can be shown that those decisions played a role in the SSO, the dollar value of those decisions has to be determined and then a multiplier added to it, and that factored into the enforcement action. Now, Pacifica, they are keenly aware of this, as this was a factor in this $2.3 million fine against them for an almost 7 million gallon spill of partially treated sewage a few years back. And in this particular case, the cost of repairing one backup generator at their wastewater treatment plant, the maintenance was deferred, which resulted or significantly contributed to this particular spill. The repair bill for that backup generator was factored into this $2.3 million fine. Now, the other thing to keep in mind if enforcement action is going to be taken against us, in addition to economic advantage, are SSO volume spilled. There are two places in the California Water Code that assign a dollar value of $10 per gallon of untreated or partially treated sewage spilled. Now, hopefully, that's where you start, but hopefully in negotiations with the enforcement staff, you can negotiate downward. But nevertheless, we are facing $10 per gallon right out of the gate. And this underscores the importance of having defensible volume estimates, as this particular case study illustrates. Now, this district, enforcement action proceeded against them, and at the end of the day, the State Water Board and the Central Coast Regional Board, they levied a fine against the district of $1.1 million. Now, in the grand scheme of things, not a tremendous amount of money, but if you put it in terms of their annual operating budget, this accounts for a little more than 50%. This was a hefty fine, and this really hurt. Now, the key or central issue in this enforcement action were vast differences in the estimated volumes of the spill between the State Water Board engineers and the district. The district had reported to the state they spilled 400,000 gallons. The State Water Board engineers, however, through their calculations, they estimated the volume was closer to 3 million gallons. Now, again, at $10 per gallon, we're talking some serious differences in dollars. And this underscores the need to have defensible, documented SSO volume estimates. If any of you would like more information on SSO volume estimation training, workshops, and other resources, please drop me an email after today's webinar. I'll be happy to share it with you. Okay, now let's go into a few SSO enforcement case examples that directly involved failed pump stations. In this particular case, City of Escondido, failure of a main plant influent pump station, $134,000 penalty. Cambria Community Services District, overflow 257,000 gallons, again due to a failure of a influent plant sewage pump station, $227,000 penalty. Santa Cruz County Sanitation District, 89,000 gallons spilled, and again due to a failure of a large sewer pump station, $276,000 fine. Costa Mesa Sanitary District, and on this particular case, we had a $416,000 penalty assessed, and again, this involved failed pump stations. So let's switch gears from regulatory liability and hit some key issues on civil liability real quick before getting into what we need to start thinking about in emergency planning for our pump stations. This is the average cost of a sewer backup impacting a single-family home in California. Don't get too hung up on the numbers. The takeaway on this is about 25 years ago, the average cost was running around $4,000 per incident. The average cost now statewide is running closer to $26,000, $27,000 a hit. There are a lot of reasons for this that I'm not going to get into today. The takeaway is simply that they cost a lot of money. Now, in this particular case, we had, again, a sub-regional pump station, very large pump station that failed one night due to a large storm and a power outage. Now, while this pump station was equipped with a backup generator on site, the computer controller for the generator failed. And as a result, the pump station was non-operational. Now, in this particular incident, we had over 100 homes and businesses that were impacted by this particular failed pump station. The potential loss exposure, or in other words, the potential dollar value of all of those damaged homes and businesses was pegged at $70 million. And as you can see, when a pump station fails, depending where it is and what it serves, it can result in some really, really significant damages, both to private property and your customers, as well as in real dollars. Now, in this particular case, there ended up to be 265 plaintiffs, representing over 100 damaged homes and businesses. Okay, so let's talk about what the State Water Board enforcement personnel keep seeing during their SSMP audits related to pump stations. And hopefully we can take away some lessons here and make sure that we've got our ducks in a row before the State Water Board visits us and finds the same things. Something to keep in mind is during an SSMP audit, your pump stations are almost always going to get a visit. These are structures that the State Water Board is very interested in. If you want to see completed actual SSMP inspection reports, you can find them on the State Water Board's website, or email Jim Fisher at the Water Boards, and you have his email right there. He welcomes your emails, and he looks at this as an opportunity for everyone to learn. So some common pump station issues that they see. Employees don't know how a particular station networks with the surrounding collection system. As we all know, this is very important because we can use our system as a holding basin, if we will, when we have a pump station fail, to buy us time before we actually see an overflow. Also, access to critical replacement parts, emergency repair resources, whether or not an agency has the adequate resources to respond to a station failure. Knowledge of the local low point, or in other words, when a pump station fails, where in your system is it actually going to overflow, so that we can get out there ahead of time. And related to that is, once we know where a station is going to overflow, the State Water Board wants to make sure that your staff is aware of where all the local storm structures are, so they can get there and protect them, hopefully, before they're impacted, or at least mitigate the impacts should they arrive after the fact. Another thing that the State Water Board is keen on is making sure that pump stations are equipped with signage or other form of alarms that will notify surrounding neighbors, if that is applicable, so that they can alert you when problems come up. So let's address a few of these issues. First and foremost, employees don't know how a particular station networks with the surrounding collection system. And what you see here is a line diagram from a sample pump station emergency response plan. We got rid of all of the sewer lines, and now what we're just showing are the pump stations and the direction of flow. What this allows an employee to quickly determine is where they can go in their collection system to shut off pumps and start using holding times in our wet wells to buy us time to deal with the failed pump station. More on that later. Access to emergency repair resources. If you have already identified which vendors have the resources and expertise to help you out should it become necessary, make sure it's written down and your employees have access to that and know how to obtain those resources under emergency circumstances. Next, employees not having knowledge of the local low point. What you see here is a Google Earth image identifying exactly where a particular pump station would overflow, and then identifying all of the nearby storm inlets so that staff knows exactly where to go. This shaves minutes off of your response, and as we know, minutes equals gallons spilled. The more minutes we can shave off our response, the fewer gallons end up getting spilled. Next, having visual or audible alarms to let neighbors know to report problems, and emergency signage. It's a simple matter to make sure that we have visible signs with a phone number for neighbors to alert us when they notice a problem, whether it's vandalism or just something not right. And in this particular case, CSRMA has actually had a couple of claims in the past 3 years where the high-level alarms on a pump station failed. And so the agency was not aware of a problem at the pump station. They only became aware when neighbors noticed something wasn't right, and they notified the agency. More failures that the State Water Board often see. Failure to inspect, in particular failure to inspect wet wells. Incomplete inspections, inaccurate inspections, and pencil-whipped inspections. So let's talk a little bit more about that. First, the State Water Board does not like seeing pencil-whipped inspections, just like the CHP for your heavy vehicles. They want to see documentation that indicates whoever performed the inspection took it seriously. So in this particular case, this has all the earmarks of a pencil-whipped inspection. And just like the CHP will tell you for your vehicle inspections, they want to see a check box or a set of initials in each and every single box. It takes a little bit more time, but it makes your documentation more defensible. Additionally, what does the State Water Board like to look at in addition to your pump stations? Well, obviously they're going to take a look at your SSMP, but they're also going to be asking for your standard operating procedures. More on that as we go forward. Also, records, inspection logs, whether they're computerized, and your hard copy originals. Call in, call out history, crew logs, work orders, generator logs. This is just a sampling of some of the documentation they'll be looking for. So let's talk a little bit more about what the State Water Board is looking for in standard operating procedures as well as your emergency response plans. They're going to be looking for evidence of routine wet well inspection and maintenance. The State Water Board staff like to relay a story where they were conducting an inspection. They were at a pump station, and they asked the staff member who was escorting them how often they open the wet well and take a look. And staff indicated, oh, we do this every time we're out here. The State Water Board staff was very pleased to hear this, and when they asked staff to open up the wet well so they could take a look, the bolts holding the hatch to the wet well in place had rusted in place and they couldn't get it open. And this, as you might imagine, caused the State Water Board staff to lose faith and the agency staff to lose credibility. So when we are doing our pump station inspections, in particular with the wet wells, here's a little tip. Take photos, and if they're date and time stamped, even better. This provides the State Water Board staff evidence that we are in fact looking at these things, and it also gives your organization an opportunity to see subtle changes that are occurring over time that an employee may miss from week to week. Now, they will also be asking your staff lots of questions to test their knowledge of your standard operating procedures and your maintenance procedures and your emergency response procedures. And the questions that they're going to be asked aren't a big secret. The State Water Board, as well as the CWEA, they put out a list of the common questions you can expect the State Water Board staff to be asking your staff during an SSMP audit. If you'd like a copy of this, please drop me an email at the conclusion of today's webinar. So here's some tips and tricks. We already talked about taking regular date stamp time pictures of your wet wells during your routine inspections, and also with your SOPs. Another tip, make sure, one, you have them, and two, make sure they're in an area where your employees have access to them where they would need them. If you have wonderful, beautiful SOPs that live in binders on a shelf back at the main office, but where staff would really need to be referring to them is at a pump station, get a copy out to the pump station. This is something the State Water Board likes to see. So the State Water Board will be looking for your SOPs and emergency response plans in place to make sure you have them, but also that they're available and accessible to your employees when and where they would likely need them. Now this brings up a question. Where does the existing waste discharge requirement, the order where we get the SSMP requirements, where does it require us to have SOPs? Well, when this question was posed to the State Water Board Office of Enforcement, this was their response. They use provision D8 in the order as their interpretation of requiring SOPs. And this is where during an SSMP audit, they will use section D8 to ding dischargers for failure to have the necessary standard operating procedures. Now, standard operating procedures, as we know, all of them are not created equal. For example, what you're looking at here is an SOP or the manufacturer's operating instructions for a Spartan sewer cleaning machine. City of Burlingame bought one a few years ago, and they looked at this and they said, you know, our employees haven't operated this before, so this is a new piece of equipment. They're not going to be using it all the time, so every time they use it, they're going to have to kind of figure it out for the first time every time. And in the middle of the night, under pressure, this set of operating instructions isn't going to be very helpful. So what Burlingame decided to do was develop their own operating SOP on how they wanted the Spartan sewer cleaning machine operated at the City of Burlingame. And what they did is they put together a photo-based SOP that's very easy to follow, and as we all know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is zip tied to the unit, so you cannot take the unit out to the field without necessarily bringing the SOP along with it. This makes sure that the SOP is conveniently accessible to employees when and where they would need it the most. Now, over the past several years, especially during the recession when we saw a lot of folks retiring, a lot of organizations started getting their SOPs written. Not only for regulatory reasons, but like I mentioned, with retirements, that's a lot of institutional knowledge of perhaps walking out the door. And in many of the cases that you see here, those organizations wanted to capture that knowledge so that they would have a tool to train new employees and a standard to which they could hold employees accountable to going forward. Now, CSRMA, let's talk a little bit about what they recommend, because it ties directly in with the State Water Board's expectations, in particular for sewer pump stations. Now, one of the things that CSRMA recommends to all of their members is that you've identified the necessary core competencies for your staff. What do they need to know to be successful at their job? It's going to be different for every agency, but we do have some commonalities. We all do line cleaning, perhaps, point repair, bypass pumping, etc. And once you've identified all the necessary core competencies, the things your employees must know how to do, these things become the things that are important enough to have written SOPs behind. If it's important enough to be a core competency, we need to have a written SOP not only for training, but also to be able to determine what good looks like, what success looks like. In absence of an SOP, employees are left to figure it out on their own or make up their own way of doing things, or it's going to be the judgment of whatever supervisor happens to be supervising that work activity today, this week, this month, this year. SOPs establish, as the name implies, a standard. And also CSRMA recommends to their members that you have a documented and ongoing employee training and proficiency testing program just to combat something known as procedural drift. Bad habits always creep into our work habits. That's just part of being human. This has been long recognized by the U.S. military, as well as high-risk industries such as medicine and nuclear power, chemical manufacturing. Humans will always try to find the better, easier, faster way of doing things. Oftentimes this means altering an established standard way of doing things. And just making sure that everyone's singing from the same page in the choir book from time to time helps combat procedural drift. If there is a better way to do it, update your SOP. But if it's a standard, we need to stick to our standard operating procedures in order to avoid error and problems. Okay, so why does CSRMA put so much emphasis on this? Well, it's because human error is the single largest cause of things going wrong. And human error can do lots and lots of bad things. Core competencies, SOPs, training and testing is the easiest to implement error reduction strategy. CSRMA didn't figure that out. We can tie this back to lessons the U.S. military has known since the 1920s. And we just have adopted that belief, and it's very, very effective. Now, if you are curious about the role human error plays in things going wrong, go to Google News and type in the search terms human error and accident. On the day I did it, I got 39,000 news stories that day on the internet about accidents being attributed to human error. This is where things are going to go wrong. But we have to remember, human error doesn't have a value. Human error means we didn't recognize we were doing something incorrectly until after the fact. That's why it's called human error. If we knew ahead of time we were deliberately violating our rules, policies, and procedures, that's not human error. That's violation. And we need to understand the difference between human error and deliberate violations. Because human error is where we're going to have problems when we ask our employees to respond in an emergency fashion to a set of circumstances they don't do all the time. That is the most error-prone type of activity. So here's a quiz for you. Which is easier to change? The conditions or systems under which people work, or human nature? And hopefully we all answered the first one, conditions or systems under which people work, because I don't think in any of our lifetimes we're going to engineer out human error from human nature. So we need to just understand human error is always going to happen. Our job is to reduce the likelihood of occurrence and reduce the impact when it does occur. This has a direct bearing on how we write our standard operating procedures and how we write our pump station emergency response plans. Excuse me. So I talked about human error. If you'd like a definition, here's the one that I like the best. But something that's interesting about human error is it doesn't just happen. Human error, according to the research that's been done over the past 100 years or so, always has precursors. Things will contribute or trigger someone to make a mistake or an error. And we can identify those things. And here is a short list. This is actually an error precursor list that a chemical manufacturer here in the San Francisco Bay Area uses. Whenever they buy a new piece of equipment, put a new piece of equipment in service, or they write or alter a standard operating procedure, they go through this error precursor list. If you work at a chemical manufacturer, as you might imagine, they don't have a lot of margin for error. They need to make sure things go right every time. And we can do the same thing. And when we ask ourselves, how many error promoting factors are there when our staff responds to a failed pump station or SSO or a backup into private property, or any of the other two bullets you see on your screen, we can apply this same list. I would argue that if we're responding to a failed pump station, our staff is working under a lot of time pressure. They're probably juggling a lot of different things, and if they make a mistake, it could be irrecoverable. It could damage equipment, it could cause the SSO to be worse, or worse yet, someone could get hurt. And if we don't have a written emergency response plan with how we are expected to respond to a failed pump station, we are going to have some unclear or just plain lack of standards. What am I supposed to do here? And we can go on and on through this list. So as we can see, pump station emergency response plans, we need to put some thought into how we write them if we expect them to be useful when we need them the most. So with that in mind, here's the basic levels of human performance. We need to keep this in mind because this is going to make our SOPs and our emergency response plans better. Humans basically have three levels of performance, and this isn't anything new. We have skill-based behavior, rule-based behavior, and knowledge-based behavior. Skill-based behavior is those behaviors you can do in your sleep. You've done it so many times, you can carry a conversation while performing that task. A good example is if you can tie your shoes while holding a conversation. Congratulations, tying your shoes is a skill-based behavior for you. Now, rule-based, this is less error-prone than skill-based, which is the least error-prone. But nevertheless, rule-based behavior has some problems if the rules that I'm applying are incorrect. More on that as we go forward. But here's the one we need to focus on, knowledge-based behavior. This is when we're doing something for the first time, or we haven't done it very often. And so when we're doing it, we actually have to operate very, very slowly and figure out solutions on the fly. This is the most error-prone of all behaviors. The error rate that has been calculated for anyone performing a task in the knowledge-based realm is 50-50. Our job is to make sure our SOPs and our emergency response plans move our employees out of the knowledge-based realm and into the rule-based realm, which is less error-prone. More on that as we go forward. So here's the question hopefully everyone's asking right now. What risk control system do we have in place to make sure each response goes as planned, whether it's an SSO, a sewer backup, or responding to a failed pump station? Now in this particular case, here's an employee. First off, he was fine. He was taken to the local hospital, given some antibiotics, treated and released same day. But it could have been much worse. In this particular case, this was a new employee who'd been assigned to a more experienced employee to shadow him, watch and learn. And on this day, they were operating a rotor. The rotor began talking a little bit to the more experienced operator. The more experienced operator asked the employee to go up to a manhole that he had indicated, asked him to pull the lid off and tell him what he saw. Well, obviously, the rod had come out of the pipe, coiled up in the manhole, sprung out, and got him in the leg. This could have been much, much worse. The accident investigation revealed that the organization didn't have an SOP for how to operate their continuous rotor. And in this particular case, it resulted in all of their operators operating the equipment differently. And this resulted in this particular, had a direct bearing on this particular accident. The takeaway is simply this: without SOPs, what forms the basis for training on your organizations of the right way to do things? So this goes right back to the State Water Board. If you haven't seen their Pre-SSMP Audit Questionnaire, I highly encourage you to get a copy if you'd like the most current version. Either contact the Office of Enforcement or drop me an email. I'll be happy to send it over to you. But in Section 11 of this Pre-SSMP Audit Questionnaire, Collection Staffing and Training, questions are asked. Does your agency have a program in place to identify and document the core competencies? And does it identify gaps in competencies and capabilities? In other words, do you do some periodic proficiency testing? This sounds remarkably similar to what CSRMA recommends to their members as well. The State Water Board is asking for this for the same reason CSRMA does. It reduces the opportunity for errors to be introduced into how we operate our collection system, and it helps guarantee better and more reliable operation. So back to the State Water Board SSMP audits. What else do the State Water Board inspectors like to see? If you have any overcrossings or undercrossing for rivers and creeks and streams, they will likely want to see those. They will also likely want to visit previous SSO locations. And they will take a look at your sewer equipment and vehicles, as well as any main lines, laterals, manholes that are of interest to them. They'll be taking a look at your SSO emergency response equipment. And as we talked about, they will be interviewing your staff, testing their knowledge, experience, and understanding of your organization's emergency response plans and standard operating procedures. And as we pointed out, one of the areas that they commonly find agencies lacking is documentation. So again, we've all heard the phrase, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. We need to make sure that our documentation rises to the level of professionalism the State Water Board is expecting. They will also talk to your operators during an inspection and take a look at your inspection checklist for your pump stations. And those inspection checklists, they want to see more than just pump run times and things like that. They want to see things on your pump station inspection checklist that are in place to help guarantee reliable operation of that asset. So for example, if you have security lighting to help ward off vandalism, that needs to be on your inspection checklist, so that the operator making the rounds will take a look and make sure that the lighting hasn't been broken. Oftentimes vandals will break security lighting ahead of doing whatever they intended to do, and just wait and see how long it takes an organization to notice that the lighting was out. So here's some tips and tricks. Take the time to pre-plan, make sure everyone understands your SSMP, where your emergency response procedures are, what is in them, as well as where your SOPs are. And this is all designed to make sure that we're viewed as the professionals that we indeed are. Okay, let's move on to taking a look at actual pump station emergency response plans. As a way of introducing this, let's use a case study with Redwood City. A handful of years ago, in their Redwood Shores community, which lies right on the bay, where they have 29 pump stations, most of which are located within a few feet of San Francisco Bay, a creek, or a lagoon. They don't have a whole lot of response time when something goes wrong. They had one of their larger pump stations fail, and they ended up spilling 57,000 gallons into the bay. Now, in this particular case, the news article interviewing the public works superintendent at the time, it becomes very evident they were very frustrated because they had all the information they needed to effectively and quickly respond to this failed pump station. The problem was the information was scattered in multiple places. This cost them time. And the time that was wasted hunting down the necessary information, the sewage kept spilling. So I said it before, and I'll bring it up again. Our goal is to shave minutes off of our response, because fewer minutes, the more minutes we can shave off our response, the fewer gallons that end up getting spilled. At the end of the day, following this event, they put together their emergency response plans for all of their pump stations, and this little line diagram right here would have saved them, in their own estimation, a half hour. This one little line diagram right there. A half hour is a lot of time when we have a pump station spilling. Now let's switch to Nevada Sanitary District. Their complete system map, including 39 pump stations, this is their complete map, but their map book that lives in every one of their trucks is 159 pages long. That looks like what you see on the screen. And they said there's got to be a better way, because this is going to take our staff a lot of time to figure things out. And this is the network block flow diagram for all 37 of their pump stations. One page, and it's very clear, showing where everything flows, how everything interacts with each other. And again, it's all designed to shave minutes off of our response. Now, back to the State Water Board pre-inspection questionnaire. The State Water Board does expect us to have station-specific emergency response plans. In this document, question 9.1, does your agency's SSO emergency response plan incorporate procedures for pump stations and force main sewers? Question 419, has your agency developed standard and emergency operating procedure for each asset in the event of a power and/or pumping failure? This clearly indicates the State Water Board does expect us to have emergency response plans that have been tailored and are specific to each of our pump stations. So why do we develop these things? And well, there's a lot of reasons. The planning process is going to help you identify weaknesses in what equipment you have available, spare parts, backup equipment, maps, available knowledge of your system, and any necessary vendors you may need. 2, it expedites response and mitigates the likelihood of SSOs or the volume spilled. And again, minutes saved equals fewer gallons spilled. And 3, it helps build a defense to mitigate liability after the fact. So, the goal here is to create a standard emergency response plan for each individual pump station and make the information needed at an SSO readily available to your staff. That's our goal here. So what should they address? Well, when this question was posed to the Office of Enforcement several years ago, they said, well, at a minimum, we would like to see things like critical information about the station, some of these bullets we already talked about. They should also address things like critical emergency operating information. Do you have built-in bypass capabilities, or do you need to do a manual bypass? And if so, where are you going to bypass to? How much hose do you need? What size of pump? What size of generator are you going to need? Think about all these things ahead of time. And any local sewer and storm maps, and in particular the storm maps identifying those inlets. And do you have the necessary equipment to block your storm drain and use it perhaps as a catch system for your SSO that you can go back afterwards and empty and clean and return to your system. They also want to see local traffic control SOPs, diagrams if that's relevant. For example, if you have a pump station that has a very small footprint, doesn't have a whole lot of room next to the roadway, so you really got to be accurate where you place your pump or generator if you're going to do a bypass or need to bring in temporary power. If you don't have a lot of room, little tip, take that equipment out ahead of time, position it exactly where you want it, and either glue down rumble strips or just paint lines so that in the future, if an employee needs to take that equipment out, they can position it correctly the first time. They don't need to get in and out and keep repositioning it. Again, we're trying to shave minutes off of our response. Any local hazards, safety issues, local crossings, any other obstacles, SOPs for any equipment that may be necessary to be used in an emergency response that either staff is not going to be familiar with. In particular, if you've got employees who backfill for your sewer collections employees, perhaps your water distribution employees, if they need to have access to an SOPs, make sure that they're readily available to them. The bottom line here, we're trying to save time, trying to find necessary information. We're trying to reduce the likelihood of human error being introduced into our response, because bad things happen. Remember, with knowledge-based behavior, the error rate is 50-50 when we're trying to figure things out on the fly. Professionalism, we need to keep in mind, how do we want our organization and our employees to be portrayed following a failed pump station that perhaps results in a very large spill. And lastly, it is required as part of your SSMP. So again, we talked about this question before. What risk control systems do we have to make sure our pump station failure response goes as planned every time, regardless of the employees involved? And with that, let's go ahead and take a look at a sample pump station emergency response plan. This is from Carmel Area Wastewater District. This is their Ribera pump station, which is a stone's throw from Monterey Bay. Monterey Bay is not an area where you want to have a sewage spill. Here's the table of contents addressing everything that the State Water Board wanted to see in it, in addition to some information the district said, we want to make sure this is available to our employees in the field as well. Here's a map how we get there, along with directions and the Latin long. And here's some technical information about the station, average hold time, wet well capacity, as well as some other technical information. The power specs for this particular station, as well as any critical contact information, local hazards and cautions, and the pump station network diagram so that we know how this station interacts with their surrounding system. And here's our troubleshooting chart. And depending on the agency that we've seen put these together, everyone has their favorite format for putting a troubleshooting chart together. Some people like a table, others like a line diagram like this. But the takeaway is simply this. You and your staff know how your stations are most likely going to fail. And it's an exercise I encourage all of you to do, to get your pump station operators or those knowledgeable about your pump stations together in the same room and go through some what-if scenarios. What if we lost power to this station? What if we lost pumping capability? What do we want to do? What you see here is an example of rule-based behavior. You are making the rules ahead of time. You're doing the thinking ahead of time, so that when the station does fail, your staff doesn't have to figure this out all on their lonesome under a lot of time pressure. If we have some pre-planned solutions, it's going to make your response go much smoother. And if you don't like the line diagrams, here's another way of presenting the same information. Now, if you do have a spill from a pump station, again, this is a reportable SSO, so perhaps some regulatory reporting information. And if you need to do a manual bypass, here's where that station is going to overflow, and here's laying out the bypass for that particular station. The agency wanted some power maps as well. And they had a new SCADA system installed, and so their employees weren't really familiar with all the error messages. So they wanted to make sure that not just the pump station controls, but also the SCADA screens, that they had some examples for their employees to follow. Again, all of this is shaving minutes off of our response. I don't have to guess what a particular error code means. It's right there in front of me. And any key lockout tagout procedures, this is something that we recommend including as well, because employee safety does come first. And if you have any bypass or valving considerations that need to be made, this is a good place for those as well. If you need to bypass, in this particular case, here you can see where they're going to manually bypass to, and the bypass configuration, as well as the hose, link the hose, power needs, and pumping needs. So that's an example of a pump station emergency response plan. Your organization has all the information you need to put these things together. And in going through the process, any information you don't have is going to become readily apparent. But before we end, I would like to just give you a few other tips and tricks. We talked about this, but you'd be surprised how amazingly effective this is in terms of saving time. If you need to pre-position a trailer, a pump, or a generator, identify exactly where you want it to be parked. What this is going to allow you to do is a single employee will be able to position it without needing to get in, get out of the truck. It's going to, that they can position it correctly the first time. And if you don't have an emergency response trailer or truck with the necessary supplies, this is something that you ought to consider putting together. The example you see here is from Sewage Sanitary District. They bought an off-the-shelf trailer, then customized it themselves with shelving and cabinets that they purchased from Home Depot. So again, putting the things that your staff may need when they respond to an SSO or a failed pump station can be very effective in shaving those minutes off of your response. And emergency response drills. I can't stress the importance of this enough. There's a city on the peninsula just south of San Francisco. If you're familiar with the Bay Area, you know our traffic isn't anything that's real fun to get stuck in. But this city is right off of 101, and in the morning hours, the commute is running north into San Francisco. Running is the wrong word. It's more like slower than molasses. So they did a drill one day. They went from they were at their courtyard. All the staff was there in the morning and said, okay, we're going to do a drill. This particular pump station, which was about 3 miles north, that you needed to take 101 really to get there, because the surface streets were going to be clogged with morning commuters as well. They said, okay, let's go and let's measure our time. So staff made their way to this station through the traffic. When they got there, they realized they had the wrong couplings for the pump. So they sent a staff member back to the courtyard again in traffic to get the right couplings. Couplings weren't where they were supposed to be or where they were expected to be at the courtyard. So time was spent hunting them down, and once they were found, back in the truck, back into traffic, back to the pump station. And during this time, about an hour and a half was lost. And had this been a real incident, that would have been another hour and a half that that station would have been spilling. So again, doing drills underscores where your problems are. And it's going to give you the opportunity to fix those ahead of time. It's going to make your response quicker, more professional, and it's going to make your organization look like the professional organization it is. And the State Water Board would like to see you do drills as well. So has your agency developed standard emergency operating procedures for each asset in the event of a power or pumping failure? That's your pump station emergency response plan. They would like to see you do training and drills on those as well. And if you'd like more information on anything you saw today, please, I welcome your emails. And as the photo shows, we need to be prepared. Otherwise, bad things and bad days can happen. And with that, I'd like to wish all of you a wonderful and safe day and best wishes for no overflows. Thank you again, everybody.